Well, for more on this, we now I'm joined in studio by SABC News International editor Sophie Mokoena. A very good afternoon, Ms. Sophie. So I did see somewhere that Queen Elizabeth II was one of the people, of course, that wasn't very involved in politics. She made sure she stayed in her lane, but she did have some issues with Margaret Thatcher about not imposing sanctions on South Africa during the dark apartheid years. What's your recollection around that?
Well, you are aware that Margaret Thatcher was in support of the racist regime, and the Queen, in her wisdom, felt that that wasn't right. I think as a person who was the head of the Commonwealth, she was fully aware that there was a wave of change happening on the continent because countries such as Ghana, countries such as Nigeria were liberated and many others, and therefore, you know, South Africa was last to be liberated and the regime was resisting, and Margaret Thatcher was supporting the regime. But we are told, particularly by a person who was a representative of Lesotho in the United Kingdom as a High Commissioner, related a story that when he was delivering his documents to the Queen, when he arrived in that country to represent the Mountain Kingdom, one thing that the Queen whispered in his ears was that she was fully aware about the politics in the region, and she visited the region in 1947. And one thing that she spoke about was the tension that ensued between her and Margaret Thatcher, because she was of a view that it was time for the international community to support the liberation of South Africa. But because of the nature of how the monarchy has to conduct herself in that country and in Lesotho, they are more ceremonial. They can't really get involved in politics, contrary to what's happening in Eswatini. It was just the behind-the-scenes thing that happened. But I think also, if one was to speak to some of the senior ANC leaders who were in exile in the United Kingdom, I'm sure a similar issue might be pointed out by them. They knew where the king, or in other words, what was the Queen's view on the issue of the regime.
So how would you characterize the Queen's relationship with the African continent at large?
Well, she came in at a time where there was a revolution on the continent, or there were changes, countries such as Ghana and the others being liberated. And therefore, I think that kind of influenced his thought and her behavior towards all the colonial or the countries that were part of the colony, but also including the protectorates. And therefore, she was a bit not so hard or really trying to suppress those countries. She was trying to manage the situation, but of course still putting her country first. And therefore you'll find a situation where when she visited those countries, she really displayed a posture of someone who wants to reach out and who wants to be with the people, and someone who understood what was happening and the plight of the people. But when you speak to citizens of this continent, they are still very aggrieved. I mean, you look at the social media, the response, particularly in countries that were colonized by Britain, you can see that the anger is still there and questions are still being asked. I was speaking to our colleagues at SABC Zulu News, where they were asking me about the fact that in terms of the Zulu kingdom, the royal family wanted Queen Elizabeth I to hand over the weapons that were confiscated when Zulus were fighting with the British in the Battle of Isandlwana. And we know that even Ingonyama, the late King Goodwill Zwelithini, the last trip in the United Kingdom, he did raise this issue. You go to Eastern Cape, the issue of King Hintsa is still a thorny one. So you find that reaction where people are not convinced that indeed the royal family did try to assist Africans, and they understood the plight of the Africans. But let's see what Charles is going to do. There's now a new king, and he's too familiar with politics of the Commonwealth.
Yes, indeed. So, speaking of King Charles III, as he is now known, he's now at the British throne. Do you think that the Commonwealth will still be as subscribed to as it was under Queen Elizabeth II, especially when you hear about stories like the Australians thinking about becoming a republic?
You know, recently Barbados decided to drop the Queen as the head of state of Barbados. They now have a president who is ceremonial, but a prime minister with powers in terms of running the government. And there are many other countries who are thinking of doing the same. Jamaica is also contemplating to do the same. And therefore, I think Prince Charles is fully aware that there's a lot that needs to be done to revive the Commonwealth or change the Commonwealth in terms of the relation. You can still have this institution, but how do you change it in such a way that it's not something that is being used by the royal family just for PR exercise? And therefore, I think a debate will continue. I mean, recently, you know that Rwanda hosted the Commonwealth. Very few really high-profile African leaders and others from other regions that are under the Commonwealth or who are part of the Commonwealth attended that summit. The Queen herself wasn't there because of mobility challenges, but King Charles was there. And I think the message was clear. Only last week, he was naming the gorillas in Rwanda, even though it was virtual. So he is familiar with the concerns of those who were colonized by the British. And I think, for me, I am looking at more changes, particularly the successor, William. I think growing in a different time, in a different generation, having visited Lesotho as a child.
All right, Ms. Sophie.
That will be better.
All right, we're running out of time, but thank you so much for your insights there. She's our international news editor here at the SABC, Sophie Mokoena.